Eddie Barker was someone who was never afraid to challenge the Prime Minister of the day, Lee Kuan Yew, in cabinet meetings to say, Harry, are you sure this is what you want? Well, I told my friends that I had been asked by Straits Times Press to write a biography of Eddie Barker, and I said no because I never met him. I did not feel I knew him well enough. And they said to me, oh, silly, he's one of the most colourful cabinet ministers we've ever had. It's not just a founding father. I thought about it and I did a bit more research and I thought, okay, I really need to do this.
I think I'd been to a small, tiny conference room in the Ministry of Law, which was named the E.W. Barker Room. Didn't know very much more about that. I came to recognise that very few people knew about Eddie Barker, including initially myself.
Edmund Barker was a first-generation Singaporean Eurasian of German, Indonesian, Scottish, Irish, and Japanese descent.
He was a natural sportsman. With a first-rate mind, he was head prefect at Raffles Institution. Now, Lee Kuan Yew had also been at Raffles Institution, so they became good friends.
Well, I came to know Lee Kuan Yew in the 1930s when we studied at Raffles Institution.
Barker entered Raffles College in 1939 for his stellar academic performance. He was the college's athletics champion in 1940 and captain of the rugby team in 1941.
He was a Queen's Scholar. He received a scholarship to study in the United Kingdom and chose to do law at Cambridge University. In fact, he always said, while others like Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee were interested in political discussions, Malayan Forum, he was not because he was too busy playing team sports, football, rugby, cricket. He was captain of the badminton team at Cambridge, and they did very well.
It was his love for sports that ignited a fervent desire within him to do something bigger for Singapore's sports scene.
Whilst at Cambridge, Lee Kuan Yew told me on our return to Singapore, we should never allow ourselves to be in prison because a political martyr cannot do much for his country whilst behind bars.
Upon his return to Singapore, Barker practiced law for 12 years from 1952 to 1964, specializing in civil litigation.
In September 1963, Lee Kuan Yew asked me to stand as a candidate for election in the constituency of Tanglin. I believe it was his wife who recommended me, and that when she did, he asked, "Do you think Eddie can do it?"
So that would have been a huge step for my mother, especially that now he was changing the course of his career altogether. She must have thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? Are we going to go back to struggling financially again?
Lee Kuan Yew asked Eddie Barker if he would stand for election, and he agreed to do it because he knew that he needed someone on his team who could help him win more seats.
And he won his election in 1963, and after that, he was never opposed on polling day. My father was returned unopposed for the rest of his life in politics.
If Eddie Barker had stayed on as a lawyer, he would have made millions and millions because he was a very good, very effective, very well sought after lawyer.
On 1st November 1964, Barker joined Lee's cabinet as Minister for Law. Barely 9 months as law minister, he was sharing a closely guarded secret with Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew.
It was a pivotal time, and Lee Kuan Yew needed all the good people he could gather to work with him in the Singapore government. So he knew he would be able to play an important role, a crucial role.
Of course, Mr. Lee had such ideals for what Malaysia was going to be, multiracial, multicultural. He really believed in that right from the beginning, and that's what he wanted for Malaysia. So they went to the parliament with these ideals, and I think Malaysia was not ready for such a thing. So there was a lot of tension.
It was only much later, in July 1965, when Goh Keng Swee raised the idea of separation with Tun Abdul Razak, and the negotiations started. Eddie Barker started playing a pivotal role because he was the one person drafting the separation agreements in great secrecy, mind you, because nobody could know about it. And even within the Singapore cabinet, he couldn't get help from anyone in the Singapore government, in the Attorney General's chambers.
The Prime Minister then asked whether I could draft the agreement. I replied that I would try. I went to the law library of the University of Singapore to look for precedents. I found one. That was the breakup of the Federation of the West Indies.
But when he went up to Malaysia with Goh Keng Swee to discuss the documents with Tun Abdul Razak and the senior Malaysian leaders, they always knew it could go badly wrong. And if it did go wrong, they could be arrested for treason.
And then my father came home and he just said, don't have to worry. If anything happens, I have got money saved away. Mommy knows where it is, and you will be all right.
It took 10 days for Mr. Barker to draft, circulate, amend, and finalize 3 documents: an agreement to separate, an amendment to the Malaysian Constitution to allow Singapore to leave, and a proclamation of independence.
Where I handed the documents to the Prime Minister. He said, "Thank you, Eddie. This is a bloodless coup." Prime Minister told me to get out of Kuala Lumpur as fast as I could.
The separation documents that Eddie Barker drafted, they were so skillfully done that when the Malaysian counterparts read through them, one of them paid him a great compliment. I think Tun Abdul Razak, the then Deputy Prime Minister, said to him, "Anytime you want a job in my government, I will take you." And I think Eddie felt quite proud of that.
I think Mr. Eddie Barker is an example of a lawyer who sees the larger picture, who sees the longer game, that this isn't just about the dispute, it's about the relationship. Mr. Barker wasn't just a good lawyer, he was a good diplomat.
I was always for the independence of Singapore. Even before I joined the government, I never understood why the government of Singapore should form a federation with Malaysia. So I had no regrets about the separation.
After accomplishing this momentous separation, his next big task was to build Singapore as an independent nation. He helmed 5 different ministries and was Singapore's first and longest-serving law minister with a tenure of 25 years.
After independence, Eddie Barker was given 2 portfolios. In addition to being Minister for Law, he was also Minister for National Development. And he held both portfolios concurrently for 10 years. And he has told an interviewer that the job of being Minister for National Development was one he enjoyed most, because it was about building homes for Singaporeans. Now, if you remember, in 1965, many Singaporeans still lived in essentially slums, in kampongs, villages without proper running water or sewage systems. So the government of the day had this enormous task of resettling people in proper homes which they could call their own.
So my father was involved in setting up all the foundations of our law, and then he was given that gift of national development, because I think he loved that very much.
Eddie Barker was someone who was never afraid to challenge the Prime Minister of the day, to challenge Lee Kuan Yew in cabinet meetings to say, Harry, are you sure this is what you want? Barker always told members of parliament that they must speak their mind. They must let their conscience guide them.
As law minister, Mr. Barker introduced a constitutional amendment which created the Presidential Council on Minority Rights, ensuring that minority rights were protected.
Eddie Barker, he never saw himself as a minority. He has told this story of how Lee Kuan Yew once said to him, "You will be the last Eurasian in Singapore." Because this was a time after separation when a lot of minorities, including Singapore Eurasians, were leaving Singapore because there was concern and fear about how independent Singapore would survive. And he said, "No, not the last Eurasian. I will be the last Singaporean."
Sports was Mr. Barker's first love, and rightly so, as the sporting fraternity fondly remembered him. Just as he was a dedicated team player in his competitive days, he continued to embody that spirit as a sports administrator and leader.
I suppose as his career developed, he was pursuing his love of sports in a bigger way, like opening the National Stadium and becoming the chairman of the Singapore National Olympic Council. He was very active. He used to go to all kinds of football games, hockey games, and give away the prizes.
He spent all his life here trying to do good for Singapore. Even after he retired from Parliament and from the government, he was put in charge of the Singapore Turf Club. He was chairman of the Singapore Stock Exchange.
Mr. Barker never rested on his laurels. After retiring from politics in 1988, he continued to serve on the boards of esteemed companies until his health declined.
The realization came to us in 1999 when he started being ill and he fainted on a plane. He had a weak liver, he had a few conditions, but we didn't know about it.
On 12th April 2001, Eddie Barker passed away at the age of 80. He was a gentleman's parliamentarian, a winsome Speaker of the House, and a man who loved life as much as he loved sports and his country.
Enjoy yourself, it's later than you think. It comes from a song, but the message there is life is short, make the most of it. But he said it a lot, and I think that quote really encapsulates his philosophy.
He was a really larger-than-life figure who I think would have been a great person to have at a party. And the more I learned about him, the more interesting I thought he was as a person, but also potentially as a role model for our students. And that, I think, is what we're really trying to do with the E.W. Barker Centre for Law and Business, is produce research that is policy relevant, hopefully carry forth the important work he did as Singapore's longest ever serving Minister for Laws.
Today, his legacy lives on, shaping the hearts and minds of generations through education in Singapore.